Hello. Ooh, feel like I'm back at theater camp. Um, Thanks everyone for coming. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that this place and our surrounding community occupy the stolen territory of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo people. As we seek to decolonize our scholarly efforts, I encourage us all to think about the ways that our work, and especially our institutions, are complicit in perpetuating oppression and violence through colonial pursuits, and to actively engage in our work in ways that lead to co-liberation for all oppressed peoples. That, I'll introduce our speaker today. Dr. Katie Cito is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. As an interdisciplinary scholar, her research lies at the intersection of political ecology, governance theory, and sustainability science. Using frameworks from these fields, her research investigates the equity, sustainability, and governance of marine and coastal systems and the reciprocal relationship they have with human well-being and conflict. She is interested in understanding fisheries sustainability at multiple scales, and her research focuses on ecology and governance of marine systems, seafood within local and global food systems, and issues of maritime security and globalization. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you. Can folks hear me? Just checking right now. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alyssa and everyone, for having me. I've had such a really, really wonderful day so far meeting with folks and talking about a truly diverse array of things pertaining to marine science and social justice and not. And it's been really, really wonderful so far. So thanks for having me. So yeah, I want to just start this talk by sort of introducing myself. I want to also say that you guys are kind of guinea pigs. I'm going to present 2 studies today, as well as some emerging work that I have never presented before. So I'll be a little more reliant on notes than I usually am, and hopefully the timing will be right. But I'm excited for sort of Q&A too, because it's pretty recent stuff. But yeah, I wanted to begin this talk by sort of introducing myself and situating myself within a larger background and perspective. So I come from an interdisciplinary environmental studies training that has focused mostly on marine ecology as well as political science. And I'm currently an assistant professor. I will be an associate professor in 6 days, so I keep having to check in on that to make sure I'm still an assistant professor, but I am. And in the Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. And as Alyssa said, most of my work, the way I think of it is that I spend most of my time thinking about who does or does not have access to marine and coastal resources and spaces, why that is, whether it's just or equitable, and how it could be improved. So just a brief thing about definitions. We could talk about concepts of equity and justice, and there are at least 10 different concepts of equity that I could define for you right now based on things that I know. I'm sure that there's more out there. But before we go too far into marine science and social justice, I just want to touch base about basic terms for people with diverse backgrounds. So here I've just pulled the Oxford American Dictionary definition, which calls social justice justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. You can think about that in a lot of different ways. I think about this specifically when it comes to marine resource spaces. And I do want to say that while I think most people in this room have a sense of what marine science is and maybe doesn't need a definition, I will say that when I say marine science, I mean both social science and biophysical science. So things like politics and economics and sociology, as well as things like biology, ecology. I also want to say I love this cartoon by Bob Mankoff. And for those who maybe can't see it, there's the little fish that says, there is no justice in the world. The bigger fish that's about to eat it says, there is some justice in the world. And the biggest fish that's about to eat both of them says, the world is just. So obviously I love this cartoon because there's fish, but also I love it because it really well articulates this issue that of perspective within distributional justice, right? So the actors within this question are actually really important to think about. So on the one hand, we can envision sort of who these actors may be. It might be least developed countries, middle income countries, and most developed countries, right? It could be small scale fishermen, semi-industrial fishermen, and industrial fishermen. It could take different forms, but we can also kind of see how your perspective on what social justice is or what is just also varies between actors, not just based on your personalities, but also on your positionality, right? How you are situated in the world and how you're situated in relation to each other. So today I'm just going to share a couple projects that we've been working on recently. Collaborators, students, and I have been recently published to think about different forms of social justice when it comes to marine science. So I'll talk about the case of small-scale and industrial fisheries conflict, specifically in West Africa. I'll talk about equity and justice in food systems, with seafood food systems in Oceania, as well as some emerging future work. I will say, based on conversations today, I've had such great conversations with folks. I wish I could do like 10 more things with this presentation and have more conversations, but I'm happy to talk about other stuff later on. Okay, so delving into fisheries conflict. Before we jump right in, I want to just describe these two sectors and kind of how I know them a little bit better. So for those who aren't familiar, global industrial fisheries take about 80 million tons of fish per year. Trade in fish products for human consumption has increased about 5-fold since the 1970s. And industrial fishing vessels are generally made of metal with hydraulic technologies, inboard motors, and they generally fish for export to developed countries and for sort of high value species and profit. In contrast, the small-scale fisheries that dominate a lot of the developing world are comprised primarily of sort of dugout or planked canoes. They're often propelled by paddle sail or small outboard motor, and they generally fish for subsistence or local or regional markets. But these two fleets, which really represent oftentimes incredibly different objectives, economic objectives, different constraints, different economic or nutritional beneficiaries, oftentimes operate in the same areas and target a lot of the same stocks in the world. And that has a lot of implications for resource justice, resource equity. So all over the world where we have this overlap between small-scale and industrial fishers, people have noted a growing occurrence of incidents between small-scale and industrial fishers. So these incidents describe conflictual interactions, including things like assault, abandonment at sea, and in some cases, even cases of murder. So these cases have also been implicated in piracy in the media and a host of human rights abuses. So what does this look like? Well, let's see if this works. This oftentimes looks like the destruction of nets and boarding of vessels to ask for compensation from those nets. So that's what you can see here on the left is two fishermen talking with a government official about a net that was torn by an industrial vessel. This picture on the right is a picture of a person who boarded a boat to ask for compensation and was hit on the head with a metal pipe and tossed overboard. So these were questions that I became really interested in Sierra Leone during my master's work. I thought I was talking to a lot of fishermen about, what are the biggest problems that you're facing? I thought I was going to face a lot of our fisheries are declining and, abundance questions, and I did not. I got a lot of answers about industrial fishing incursions in small-scale areas, So the work I'll present today is the result of a collaboration with academic partners. So people like Kate O'Neill at Berkeley and Dennis Aheto at the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. also practitioners. So this is Theo Quadrese. Theo works for the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources in Ghana, as well as I definitely want to point out that none of this would happen without the help from 3 undergraduate research assistants who were absolutely key to this work. So Maya Banks, Carly Cole, and Allison Schaefer. Okay, so the question that I really wanted to understand was, what explains patterns of conflict and cooperation at sea? So the dominant theory that I heard of when I talked to people about fisheries conflicts was that this was a resource scarcity conflict, right? This was driven by the fact that there were too few fish, too many fishers chasing too few fish. And so conflict erupts in that environment. And that just felt really unsatisfactory to me, right? It almost created this image of fishermen as these like instinctive creatures that like when they have a bad day fishing, they just fight with you. And that just felt really unsatisfactory, and also didn't really reflect the people that I knew and the fishers and the perspectives that they were representing. So I wanted to understand not just the conditions in which these conflicts occurred, but also what are the conditions in which they don't occur, right? Like when is it that you have fishers that get along, that cooperate, that create these, you know, cooperative actions together at sea when there isn't necessarily government oversight? And I will say, like, this is a really hard question to try to think about. It's an interaction that occurs only at sea. Like nobody has data on this, or so I thought. And so I was like, ugh, how do I figure out how to ask this question? And I asked around and asked around and asked around, and thought I was going to do interviews, thought I was going to do surveys, and then thankfully, through talking with Theo Quadrese, who's one of my co-authors, he said, oh, it sounds like you're describing like one of the incidents at sea. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he shows me this piece of paper that's on his desk that was a full report from a small-scale fisherman about a conflict that he had had with an industrial fisher at sea with like date, time, depth, associated village waters, you know, target fishing, what kind of boat he was using, like so much really cool stuff. I was like, that's incredible. You know, how long do you have these records? And he was like, well, you know, I've been here for 3 years, so maybe like 5 years or something. And I was like, great. So we started digging. This is my undergraduate assistant, Maya, and I, in the quote-unquote archives of the Ministry of Fisheries, just piles of paper with snails in them and dirt and things like that. And we spent many months in these basements, and we found over 30 years of these records and over 1,000 cases. I will not take you down that journey with me, but I'm happy to talk about that adventure anytime people want to. But none of the records were uniform, but they had information like full narratives of what happened. They had information on, you know, all of these different aspects of the conflicts and how they developed. Okay, so what did I do with them? Well, I used a framework. Who in this room has ever heard of Elinor Ostrom? Couple people. Okay, so Elinor Ostrom is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who pioneered the theory of the commons, right? So a lot of things that push back against Garrett Hardin's tragedy of the commons idea. But one of the things that she's least known for is something called the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. You don't need to know about that. What you do need to know is that I used a development of that. So Blake Ratner and some folks developed this framework that uses the IAD framework to ask the question exactly that I wanted to understand, which is, when does conflict occur and when does it not? What leads to it and what doesn't? And what they pull out is that there are many things that need to be taken into account, right? So we've got our context on the left. These are like broader context, things like what are the governance arrangements? What is the attribute of the resource? Is it hard to find? Is it scarce? These kinds of things. The action, collective action institutions, which I'll talk about. And then there's this idea of the action arena, which is like in the moment, when you're there and you have the option to sort of conflict or cooperate, what are the rules in use? Who are the actors? And what are the action resources that they're able to pull from at that time? That then leads to these patterns of conflict and cooperation. So this is what we've developed that, right? So we took our case and we said, what does this look like here? Well, we've got our general context, right? The same sort of general context, but then we've also got this immediate context. We've got the this question of like, you have an encounter at sea, and that like maybe your boat encounters the net of someone else's boat, but you don't necessarily have an interaction, right? So there's all of these immediate conditions that do or do not occur to get us to what we called an interaction. So if your net gets hit by a boat and you chase them, but you don't catch them, then you don't interact, right? There's no conflict because you never caught the boat. If it happens at night and you never saw who did it, you don't even get to pursue them, you don't have a conflict. It's when you get over here in the action arena, then we can think about what are the actors, the action resources, and the rules that lead to this, which is what we found in our interactions in these 1,063 cases, right? Which is, we found 3 cases of abduction, 3% of cases involved abduction, 18% of them involved violence of some kind, 16% involved threatening, 57%, the majority involved arguing, and then we've got these, these interesting 30%, 8%, and 10% that involved cooperation, compensation, or attempted compensation. So now we can sort of take this apart, right? And say, okay, what gets us to those green outcomes? What gets us to those red outcomes? And I'm gonna, there's so much more to talk about with all of these things than I want to, but I'm gonna go pretty briefly through all of these. But what we found was that some of the things that we found that were associated, I'll talk about conflict first, right? So what was associated with those red conflictual outcomes? And what we found was that it was really these disparities between what we call the action resources between industrial and small-scale fisheries. So what Ratner calls action resources are the tangible and intangible assets that give actors the capability for agency. So what that means is like, the more assets you have, the more education, the more money, the more time, the more choices that you can perceive between conflicting and cooperating. And so the more action resources that you have, the more of these assets that you have, the more you're able to kind of see different options. And in Ghana, as in much of the world, the differences between these action resources between small-scale and industrial fishers is dramatic, right? In Ghana, small-scale fishers oftentimes have really limited financial capital. The capital that they do have is purchased on credit or loaned, and it frequently represents a very, very large proportion of your wealth, maybe greater than your own personal wealth, right? There's also no insurance scheme in the small-scale sector, so if your net gets torn, you're on your own. That is dramatically different to the industrial sector, where the operations of the fishing company itself are the ones that are, that's who's responsible, right? It's not personally or individually sort of absorbed. There's a ton of different stakeholders. There are the owners, the fishing companies, operators. There's not a single entity that this falls on, and that there is insurance. And so it just dramatically changes the number of options that you have in the case of a loss of capital or in the case of a conflict like this. So what that means is that one party is dramatically incentivized to pursue restitution at sea and a conflict, versus the other party that's dramatically incentivized to flee as quickly as possible and never try and engage with that at all. The second thing we pulled out was this disparate notions of legitimacy and cohesion. So you probably, one of the most famous fishing communities in the world are the Fante fishermen of Ghana. They have populated the entire West African coast with like fishing people. They are a fishing group for millennia. It is deeply a part of their culture. It is deeply a part of their diets. They have been around for literal millennia, and they've been fishing in similar ways for that long. In contrast, so that's these folks on the right. In contrast, the industrial fishery was started in the 1960s. It was created as a development project to produce revenue for the government. And so you have these really, really different senses of like, who's a legitimate fisherman in Ghana, right? Because of that, this, again, sort of leading to these conflictual outcomes, is that a small-scale fisherman would be like, they're not supposed to be here. Like, who are they? They're not supposed to be here. They are predominantly not Ghanaian owned and operated, although technically on paper they are. It's a lot of sort of Chinese, Korean, and European ownership, versus, you know, these people that are incredibly community-based and have been working in these areas for centuries. So that concept of legitimacy, like who has a right to be here, who's supposed to be doing this, also really shapes conflictual outcomes. Finally, and I just thought this was really interesting, there's different rules and norms of behavior. So when we looked through these records and when we talked to people, we realized that small-scale fishermen respect the authority of the chief fisherman. Industrial fishers don't. Industrial fishers respect the authority of the state, which is very, very not that involved in these conflicts. So, you know, when small-scale fishermen would say, oh no, like these industrial fishermen have done something illegal, the laws or rules that they would have transgressed would have been local laws or rules, cultural norms, or national laws or rules. Whereas the industrial fishermen would do something completely different, and they would not know any of the local cultural norms, would not know any of the things that kind of were handed down from chief fishermen over millennia. They would only know things like the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, things like you don't board a boat, things like, you know, no piracy. And so they're pulling from totally different sets of rules about what they thought was acceptable and what wasn't. So there's this just essentially what's called different sea tenure systems. They're just pulling from totally different cultures, totally different sets of expectations about who is legitimate in this space, what is expected in this space, and how things are supposed to be done. So you can understand why that's probably the case where you'd get conflict. We also asked the question, why do we seek cooperation? And I think this is actually a really key thing that Ghana was able to offer. And Ghana has two specific laws I'll talk about, right? So one of them is that every boat is required to have 75% Ghanaian crew. And that changes everything. That makes it so that you now have someone on these boats who can speak the local language, who knows local cultural norms, who can speak to the existence of institutions on shore that can mediate this conflict and know that it doesn't have to be sorted out on the boat. And it changes everything. So they are able to create this bridging social capital between these two different cultures and alleviate that moment and say, no, we don't have to do this now. Let's go on shore and work this out. That does not exist does not exist in Sierra Leone where industrial boats don't come to shore. So that's kind of a key law and policy. The other one is my favorite thing ever. No one is excited about this as I am, but it's something called the Arbitration Committee. So the Arbitration Committee is a special committee that is quasi-governmental. It's made up of representatives from artisanal fishing, industrial fishing, and the government. And when you have a conflict, you can go to this committee to have it arbitrated. It keeps things out of the court system, and it puts it in this sort of specialty forum where they can mediate this conflict. So I got to see what this looks like, and it's just fascinating. So what happens is they set a date, and the industrial fishers come in. So these are the industrial fishers right here. You can see they're all Chinese. These are the small-scale fishers. They are all Ghanaian. And they talk it out, right? So they take this piece of plywood, They draw with chalk what they think happened. They say, no, that didn't happen, this happens. Then they erase the chalk and they put the chalk back in, and they talk it out. And then they go to their separate corners and they figure out what they're willing to offer for restitution, and then they come back, and that's how it's done. This is like earth-shattering from an institutional perspective, right? It ensures that Ghanaian fishermen do not have to get restitution. They do not have to fight at sea to get compensation for their torn net or face essentially destitution. They can seek restitution in this other way. So main takeaways, this is one of the hardest, it's one of the studies I love the most. It's one of the hardest ones to talk about because there's no visuals, right? It is very qualitative, it is very social. It is not pretty to look at. I'm gonna show y'all some very pretty things next, so bear with me. But I think it's really, really, really interesting and really important to note that it is not based on this instinctual conflict based on scarcity that fishermen fight, right? It is for very, very important contextual, institutional, and economic reasons of development and underdevelopment, why people are in these positions that incentivize them to do that or not do that. There are, in a very optimistic way, there are specific policy choices, specific management choices we can make to do this better, right? It's not about spatial management and separating the fleets. It's not about increasing the abundance of fish and hoping that that will deal with scarcity so now they won't conflict. Those are not the answers. The answers are these very specific policy choices that create dialogue between these really, really dramatically different cultures and political economies. Pretty much the same thing, but I think pulling out and looking at these contexts, right? Like, how can we think about insurance schemes and how they would change the incentives? How can we think about distribution of wealth and how they would change those incentives to conflict? Not something we looked at, but something to point out as, you know, if these factors lead to conflict, addressing the underlying factors would help us to get ahead of that. Okay, oops. Okay, well, fisheries and food systems, so that says the wrong thing, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about fish and food. So moving on to the second study. Has anybody in this room ever been to the country of Kiribati? Has anybody ever heard of the country of Kiribati? Did you think it was Kiribati? Yeah. So it's actually pronounced Kiribati. So we're gonna totally pull out from West Africa and fisheries conflict and institutions. And we're gonna think about the Pacific, and we're gonna think about fish as food, and we're gonna think about the importance of fish as food. So Kiribati is a very small, developing state in the middle of the Pacific, and it is truly, truly an ocean nation, right? So it has 3 different island chains, which you can see right here, the Gilberts, the Line Islands, and the Phoenix Islands. It has 4,243 times the amount of ocean as it has land. So it is absolutely dramatically an ocean country, right? And to explain to you sort of the reliance of these people on seafood and on fish, you probably can't see that very well, but it's the top countries in the world for consumption of fish. Individuals in Kiribati eat about 115 kilograms per person per year in Kiribati, in comparison to the global average of 15, in comparison to the US average of 7. So 7 kilograms of seafood per person per year versus 115. Like, it is a dramatic reliance on seafood for nutrition. This is where we did our work. So it is, this is the Gilbert Islands, this is the Line Islands, and this is the islands where this work was situated. Okay, so bear with me on this one, but the idea behind this work, or the basis of this study, was to understand how environmental health, which is here on the left in green, did or did not translate through these sort of yellow governance and economic processes. Governance in yellow, economic in blue, to create these 4 typologies of health outcomes. So obviously this is wildly oversimplified, but we considered that based on levels of traditional versus Western processed foods, diets would end up being either sort of traditional, which we said was high seafood, low Western food, mixed, which is high seafood, high Western foods, undernourishing, which would be low seafood, low Western diet, or overnourishing, which we consider to be low fish, high Western diet. Western being processed foods, high fat, high sugar. And to understand these dynamics, we collected an absolute ton of data, like a ton. So here on the left is what we did in sort of the ecological sphere. So underwater visual census, benthic surveys, lagoon flat surveys. We tested for toxins. We tested for ciguatera. We tested for heavy metals, all of these things. We also did a nationally partnered with folks to do a nationally representative household income and expenditure survey, a village survey of experts, and a market survey. And on the health front, we collected blood samples and breast milk samples to understand prevalence, indicators of cholesterol, diabetes, dietary intake, biometrics, tons of stuff. This is our team. So I won't go through everybody, but I will go through everybody. So Chris Golden, Jessica Gephardt, Jacob Urich, Whitney Friedman, Jessica Zambarane Mason, Arista Takeas, Eliatera Aram, Arantes Tekiao, and Mike Sharp. In country, out of country, academic, non-academic, a really, really great team to work with. Could not have done it without them and so many more. But so we took that ton of data, and this is a part of this that I'll talk about today, but most specifically we took the socioeconomic data and the market survey, and we used a random forest model and a cluster analysis to operationalize access theory and trace the flows of consumptive benefit in this food system. What does that mean? Has anybody ever heard of access theory? Great, okay, great. What does that mean? Well, it means that we took this Ribot and Peluso theory, developed in 2003, which is called a theory of access. And what it does is a theory of access says we can't say, it defines access as the ability to benefit from things, right? And it wants to understand those times and places where the ability to benefit from things doesn't line up with rights, right? So I can benefit from a fish without having a right to catch it. Or I can, in the case of poaching or something like that. I can also not benefit from fish when I do have a right to catch it, right? Like maybe I don't have a boat, or maybe I don't have the knowledge to do that. And so it breaks apart this idea of like having rights doesn't mean that you benefit. And so how can we ask about flows of benefit? So we created variables. They did this through what they call 8 structural and relational access mechanisms, right? So these are them: markets, capital, technology, identity, labor, authority, knowledge, and social relationships. So if you are going to benefit from a thing, you are going to need a configuration of the structural and relational access mechanisms that gets you to that benefit. It's not just whether or not you legally have the right to fish, you need some sort of configuration that gets you there. So we created metrics for these mechanisms from our data and asked the model which variables were most important in distinguishing high seafood consumption from low seafood consumption. And interestingly, what we see is the most important one is markets, right? But if we look a little bit closer, here on the right, we say, okay, the interesting part about markets is that it's actually low market access that gives you the highest consumption of fish, which is very counterintuitive to traditional food systems. They would say more market access means more fish. Here we find the opposite. Why is that? Well, this is why. So what we can see here, this is a subset of the data, what we can see here is that in the red is seafood that was consumed by purchasing. Green is seafood that is consumed through exchange or barter. Blue is seafood that is consumed through gifting. And purple is seafood that is consumed through production. So what we see is the massive prevalence of home production and gifting, right? These non-market means of getting seafood are the ones that are the most important for our high seafood consuming households. It is not market-based metrics that are bringing food to people. But in reality, people don't just use one mechanism in order to get food, right? Household strategies deploy configurations of different mechanisms in order to maximize healthy seafood consumption. So we did a cluster analysis to see what this looked like, and we found we found six strategies, which you can see here on the top, right? They clustered through these mechanisms in certain ways. So what this looks like was our first cluster were essentially like large fishing households that used a lot of technology and a lot of labor, casual fishing households, small, older, low authority households, gifting households, wealthy urban households, and this group, which I'll talk about in just a second. Low technology people on one island that came out as this cluster. Okay, so these clusters relied on different access mechanisms to different degrees and different combinations, right? So for example, we can see cluster 5 here in the blue shows these wealthier, more urban households that had high use of markets, high capital levels, very low use of any kind of fishing labor, whereas cluster 1 in the orange has fairly average to low capital, very high fishing labor and knowledge, and high use of fishing technology, and relatively low use of markets. Interestingly to me, this also had dramatic implications for what foods were eaten by these households. So for example, we can see that our pelagics here are mostly eaten by our wealthy urban cluster, whereas the lagoon and flatfish are heavily consumed by our home producers. We can also see how important sea snails are to almost everyone, except for gifties. Fascinatingly, you don't get gifted sea snails. You just, I don't know why, but they're important to everyone unless you are reliant on gifting. And fascinatingly, there's this weirdo, right? The crabbers of Tyrina. So why is it that crab is eaten by this one? It's essentially the factor on which it clustered, right? Is like these people eat crab. What does that look like? Well, why? Any ideas? Not a lot of Kiribati familiar people in the room, but so Tyrina is one of the 3 islands in the other island chain that we studied, in the Line Islands, not the Gilberts. The Gilberts are all little tiny atoll countries. The Line Islands are not. There's a lot more landmass. And there's these. So that is a coconut crab. Coconut crabs are enormous and delicious, and they exist in abundance on Tyrina. They do not exist in abundance, or to my knowledge, at all in the Gilberts, which are these very small atoll countries. So we can see, right, that like not only do these clusters have implications for your household strategy of how you ensure sufficient food, it also has a lot of implications for what you're eating, right? Why does that matter? Well, it matters because we know that seafoods are not created equally when it comes to nutrition. For example, our sort of clams, oysters, mussels are more nutritious than things like our large pelagics, which are in turn more nutritious than things like cephalopods or crustaceans. So we can begin to think about not just what this study looked at, which is consumptive benefit, right? The amount of food, the amount of seafood that you get, the strategies that maximize eating seafood. But we can think about doing a study, and we are thinking about doing a study, that maximizes nutritional benefit, right? The flow of consumptive benefit is not necessarily the same as the flow of consumptive benefit. I mean, as nutritional benefit, right? If you eat 4,000 calories a day of white bread versus if you eat 2,000 calories a day of oily fish, leafy greens, and fruit, your nutritional benefit versus your consumptive benefit is going to look dramatically. We can begin to think about that and how to maximize something like nutritional benefit versus other goals. So yeah, this has been a really, really cool study to do. Some of our kind of key takeaways here for me is that the highest seafood consumption actually had the lowest market access, pointing to the importance in some places of non-market acquisition in a way that food systems research is really not. We also found that households that consume high and low levels of seafood exist across diverse contexts. And so consumption can't be assumed based on anything specific. There's a lot of things in the literature that's like, if you live closer to markets, you will have better consumption of food. Or if, proximity metrics or, wealth indicators or something like that. But we find that like wealthy households, poorer households, remote areas, urban areas, across all of these different demographics, household characteristics, locations, households are able to secure these really healthy seafood diets based on these specific strategies, which give us really, really cool policy tools across a ton of different contexts. Lastly, different household strategies are associated with different patterns of seafood consumed. We talked a lot about that. And we really, I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that we need to take seriously the strategies that households are already using to maximize their nutritional intake, right? So instead of saying like, oh, we need this technological solution, or we need this management solution, or all of these things that sort of bake in our concepts of the problem and our concepts of the solution. Instead, if we just ask, okay, what are people already doing to solve this problem, and how can we take that wisdom and those strategies seriously in order to move forward? I think that's like a really undervalued step. Okay, I am coming towards the end. So I wish that I had more to present on this based on conversations today. I don't, but I'm just going to talk really, really briefly about future work. So when I got my position at UC Santa Cruz, I really wanted to start thinking about access and equity in marine resources and coastal spaces at home. And I wanted to understand how to do this well. And California fisheries are exceedingly complex and very different from the systems that I had worked in. And it just, I ended up landing on that kind of not necessarily being the system that really I felt like I could have added value. So what I've really become very interested in are questions around coastal access and equity and justice in coastal access. And so I've been what I call the listening phase of this research for a long time now, about 4 or 5 years, just trying to understand what are the dynamics at play in California's coastal areas around access and around justice in access. And I'm not going to present any of that today, but there's there's a lot of really interesting stuff around sort of who does and does not have access to coastal spaces and coastal resources in California, and sort of the historical events and institutional structures that underpin that access or lack of access. And so I've gotten a couple of really small grants that I put up here to start to think about this. There's a few people doing really cool work around this. Dan Reineman at CSU, Channel Islands. A lot of folks know Charles Lester, but Charles Lester is now sort of getting more into the research space around this stuff. And I would love to chat with any of you about it. I just also want to highlight the work of some of my graduate students who've been funded by Ocean Protection Council to understand some of the equity and justice issues around specifically MPAs in California and wetlands. And then lastly, just to highlight the work of one of my graduate students, who's also been working on the CARE bus work with me. But yeah, I'll wrap up and hope to have so many conversations about all of this with everyone afterwards.
Sorry. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for that. That was awesome. I'm going to open it up to Q&A for everyone in the room first. And we're going to use the Goofy Cube. So you throw this around and speak loudly into this part. Who would like to go first? Sorry. This is why I'm not. Don't throw it.
We tested all the mics, but that one.
Thank you, Dr. Sato. This works better. Thank you, Dr. Sato. That was a great talk. I was wondering if you had any specific examples of kind of how to leverage existing cultural norms, practices, or existing solutions in kind of implementing maybe not necessarily changes, but in looking for solutions to some of the fisheries problems, because I know you kind of ended on that note with the section of Kiribati.
Oh my gosh, that is such a great question, such a hard one. Yeah, the thing that I think is always the most useful for that is to do the listening at first, right? So like one of the things that Indy, my graduate student, is doing right now, or has done, is to go around and talk to people about the traditional practices around fisheries management in Kiribati. And what's so hard about that is that people don't usually think about the practices as fisheries management practices, right? So like asking a question in a way that people can give you what you want to know without them thinking of it in the same way, right? So for example, she's been trying to understand traditional practices of fisheries management through things like, a weird word to use in different contexts, but like taboos, like, or do you have cultural associations with certain animals, like turtles that are not acceptable for cultural reasons to be harvested? And so we might think of that as a fisheries management strategy, but they would think of it as a cultural practice. And it's both, right? It is both. And so I think trying to leverage the cultural practices that can be promoted and used has to start with first figuring out what those are. And that's not always an easy thing to do, because a lot of us do conservation and do stewardship practices that we wouldn't call necessarily like management or conservation, right? They're just practices that we do that have that effect. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it's like, I do think that like there's none of these like one size fits all approaches. And so understanding the practices that have existed in a place that have been successful for a long time is a great place to start, which is what we were trying to do with the households, which is like, how are you all already doing this, right? Like, how do we make this visible? And it's actually kind of like a hard task sometimes because of the way that people think about things. I don't know if that answers your question.
Great, thank you.
I know you mentioned the difference in the amount of seafood consumed versus like the US versus the smaller islands in Kiribati, but I was wondering if there was like studies done on the actual nutritional intake and like a comparison between the nutritional intake in those smaller islands versus nutritional intake in places like the US or larger countries.
Yes-ish. So we haven't done anything in the U.S. per se, but there is a lot of work to understand the nutritional composition of specific food. So that one study that I put up is sort of like one of the many things that's out there trying to figure that out. It's a weirdly hard question to answer because so much of the nutritional value of a food happens after harvest. So how it's cooked, how it's preserved, how it's, whatever. Did you eat the whole fish? Did you eat the fillet? Did you eat the liver? Like all of those things are dramatically different things for toxins and for nutrition. So there's a lot of work around that. And so like once we have that information, we could theoretically combine it with things like FAO trade data and then be able to do a comparison between like, okay, what do people in America eat versus people in Kiribati? And then we could see that broad brush sort of nutritional information. I think that's happening. One of my colleagues, Jessica Zambrain Mason, is about to publish some stuff around that, which is really, really cool. But no, some of this, the like really detailed work around nutrition and health outcomes is so specific to people. And so like how certain diets result in or don't result in health outcomes based on like your genetics and, all of that stuff is also like a totally separate, hard field of public health where they're trying to figure that stuff out. There's a emerging discipline called planetary health, and there's a lot of folks specifically kind of in public health departments that are asking questions around sort of how environmental factors actually sort of influence public health outcomes.
Oh, thank you.
Hello. Oh, yes. Hi. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. One thing that I was really impressed by was the way that these systems, and you found these different systems where you could test some of these interesting economic and social theories. When we were thinking about, like, for us, like empirical work, a lot of times a big question is, how do you find a good system? And how do you start with the theory and then find a good system to test that theory, or do you start with the system and then kind of go the other direction? So I was wondering how you were able to, like, what was kind of the foundation for some of figuring out kind of the questions and then the theory that informed your work?
Easy question. Thank you for that one. That's a great question. I think for me, and I don't do any empirical lab work. So I think it's a different endeavor for that. But for me, with my students, I'm always trying to articulate, like, you are already thinking with a theoretical framework. You just have to figure out what it's called and whether it's the right one to use, right? So like, I already am thinking, like, even having the question of like, hey, scarcity-based resource conflict doesn't sound real here. You know, like this sounds like there's something more interesting going on with people. Like I'm already bringing in social theory that is pushing against the resource-based conflict theories of political science in the 1990s. I just didn't know that I was doing that, right? And so you have to like read a ton to figure out the questions that you're already asking and the theories that you're already deploying, and if you need to get better questions and better theories to do that. So like, you know, that's like the one piece, and then the other piece is like, this isn't exactly what you asked, but I also thoroughly believe that we all have governance questions that are important to what we're doing, right? So like, this is obviously very clear for things like endangered species stuff, like you can point to actual regulations and laws and be like, well, this is how this is relevant. But like, also, like conservation itself is policy-oriented, management-oriented, and value-driven. And so being sort of reflective on that, I think that you can sort of figure out if you need to change your theory or right? Maybe like if the theory or the framework is the thing that I'm really like, I was very interested in fisheries conflict. I really wanted to understand this thing. I needed to go to a place that had that, right? And so, you know, kind of figuring out which are the things that you care about and are really interested in answering versus like are replaceable, I think maybe iteratively will get you there. But again, I don't do lab work, so maybe that didn't make any sense.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Jumping back to your work in Ghana, thinking about like the distribution of whether it's a cooperation, abduction, violence, the different outcome pathways. Were there marked like redistributions of like the end result, like after either the arbitration committee that kind of really picked up versus the law that passed that had 75% local hands on the boat? Or was it kind of those two things working in tandem to change the distribution outcomes?
Yeah, oh my gosh, great question. I think it's definitely both things in tandem, right? Like if you have a lot of dialogue at sea, but there's no institution on land to be able to shift that dialogue and shift that like mediation, it's not necessarily going to be that helpful. And similarly, if you have that thing on land, but nobody knows about it, and there isn't that like exchange at sea to sort of shift things in that direction, it's also not going to be that helpful. I mean, so my master's work was in Sierra Leone, which is a very, very different context. Sierra Leone was in sort of a post-conflict context. A lot of the institutions, both sort of physical infrastructure and sort of governance infrastructure, was like pretty dismantled. And they didn't have an industrial fishing port. And so the boats that would come in, the industrial boats that would come in and like have incursions into these traditional areas, they didn't land their fish in Sierra Leone. They just came in and then went out again. And so these small-scale fishermen were furious, right? Because like they'd see these industrial boats come in, and then they'd take the fish, and then they would leave again and land them in another country. And so like they had no choice but like escalate, because there was no way, there was no avenue to deal with it. Whereas like you have other countries, and there's these clear sort of like known institutions that are effective at doing this thing, and it just changes the whole calculus of risk for something like that.
Thank you.